Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Wake up, Link.
The Legend of Zelda is one of Nintendo's most successful franchises. It feels like Link and Zelda have become key pillars of the gaming industry at this point, despite my mum still thinking they're the same person. If you look at any major gaming outlet's top 100 video games of all time lists, you can probably expect to see the pair of them appear quite a few times. Clearly, my love for this franchise is unexceptional, but that's not going to stop me from talking about why. Something I tend to look at pretty often on this channel is my relationships with my hyperfixations and the media I love, and then investigating exactly what it is about them that I latch onto as an autistic person. The Legend of Zelda is one of those hyperfixations that I've wanted to analyse for a very long time. I just didn't quite have a way to do it till now. 2017's The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the best-selling Zelda game of all time, and it's easy to see why. The game seems to be pretty universally beloved, especially online. When it first released, the game was praised by critics for bringing a bold new direction to the series with its open-world, exploration-based gameplay and phenomenal physics engine. When a copy of Breath of the Wild first fell into my lap, I wasn't autistic. I mean, of course I was, I always have been, but the NHS was still refusing to accept it. I've spoken about the long, frustrating path to diagnosis in depth in my Shadow video, so I won't go too far into it here. But for context, at the time of Breath of the Wild's release, despite everyone else in my life knowing I was autistic, I didn't think it was possible, because I was so used to being brushed off as just anxious or shy by my doctors. I felt a little bit like a fraud whenever I so much as considered the possibility. I think this is important to mention because I believe my relationship with Breath of the Wild in particular is founded upon who I was at the time. I was an anxious wreck, a heavily masking, heavily depressed teen with no real understanding of who I was, nor how to process the kinds of things I was going through. I'd gone from being told I was gifted by every teacher I had to watching my grades slip away from me. I felt like my educational ability was disappearing in front of me. I couldn't remember any information from one lesson to the next. And I couldn't talk to somebody about it because I both couldn't talk to anybody at all and had no real understanding of it. I felt doomed. And then one day came Breath of the Wild. And I just remember it making me feel even lower. Whoa, slow your roll, I need to make it clear now, I do not hate Breath of the Wild, quite the opposite. We'll get there. I just need you to walk with me for a minute. I launched the game and I was immediately taken aback by its unabashed lack of linearity, and the fact that it wears freedom and creativity on its sleeve so proudly in such a huge and beautiful world, and I felt overwhelmed. I wasn't very good at self-direction or self-motivation back then. I was barely getting by with everything else in my life as is. So a game from one of my favourite franchises becoming so open and almost directionless? Well, I guess it just came at a bad time for me. I could see the beauty in it, really, I could. I was continually impressed by the game and its craft, and yet it was making me feel so cripplingly alone. I don't mean in the sense that the game sets out to. I think Breath of the Wild clearly makes some powerful statements in the favour of the beauty of being alone. I just mean in a more literal sense. I would go online and see so many people connecting with the game on a level that I so desperately wanted to, and it isolated me. I turned to games in general in my childhood because of isolation and feeling like something other, and so it really deeply stung that I was now finding those same feelings in a game series that had so often been associated with safety for me. That lack of direct direction from the game just made me freeze. I would take long breaks from it before picking it back up because it simply frustrated me not knowing where the game wanted me to go next. I knew logically that there was no right order because the game just isn't set up that way. And yet I'd find myself stuck there, questioning my every move and asking myself if I was doing things the way I was supposed to. I would think, well sure, they say there's no order, but there has to be. There just has to be. I just couldn't shake that inner monologue that was so directly contradicting everything the game stood for. I couldn't really let go of my need for narrative linearity in the way the game asked me to. And I just ended up feeling stupid because of it. I did end up beating the game after a very long time, but I was only able to do it using guides and tutorials. I still found myself loving it, in particular loving the scale of the adventure and the narrative and the feelings it evoked in me, but I also found myself, after needing to use guides and tutorials, questioning if those feelings were even mine to have. This wasn't the only thing making me feel this way. I've spoken in depth about my identity and masking issues on this channel previously, but I also just experienced this feeling in other areas of my life at the time. I found that I'd go watch a movie and I couldn't really formulate my own opinion on it. Instead, I'd absorb all the other reviews on the internet and have everyone else's opinion create mine. I felt misshapen for the life and passions I had. The pieces of the life and interests of a person were all there. I just seemed to be the wrong piece to make them all fit. Now we need to fast forward half a decade or so to bring me to my main point. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was my Breath of the Wild. I think I should probably give you some context. This half a decade was actually a really important one for me. I was finally diagnosed within this time. I finished school and moved on to university. I dropped everything academically to focus on a creative degree, and I began a happy and healthy long-term relationship with my girlfriend. All this is to say, where Breath of the Wild found me at a bad time, Tears of the Kingdom found me at the best. Well, actually, not quite. I had COVID when the game released, so I felt like death throughout that first playthrough, but other than that, it was the best timing. With my diagnosis came a lot of personal research about myself. Specifically, I began to look more into that lack of self-direction and self-motivation I spoke about earlier. I read up on how that relates to autism directly. I read as many theories on the matter as I could, things like social motivation theory of autism, in some desperate attempt to understand and control these things better. I was moved out now, living on my own for the first time, and bettering my self-motivation was going to be crucial. The problem was that most, not all, but most of these articles and theories and studies that I was reading just assumed that autistic people had no interest in social engagement to begin with, and I'm sure that might be the case for others, but it just wasn't for me. My issues never stemmed from a lack of interest in social situations. I wanted to be able to make friends. I wanted to be social because a social life always seemed, on the outside, like a better life than my own. The interest was there. I just couldn't understand how to do it. I couldn't connect with people, outside of my girlfriend at least. I mean, I couldn't even connect with myself in a way that would make any of that possible. And so I would just end up getting frustrated, getting overwhelmed, locking myself in my flat and never leaving. Therapy no longer seemed like a viable option for me. I tried it many times, but I sort of came to the conclusion that if I couldn't connect with people at all, then how was I going to connect with, and be truthful, to a therapist enough for them to help? I ended up trying to build coping mechanisms and strategies for myself. One thing that I found helped to keep me motivated was to compartmentalize tasks into smaller ones so that everything felt like I was doing something, like I was achieving more. I got really good at it. It wasn't a long-term fix or anything. There's lots to say about compartmentalization that is positive, and there's as much to say about it that's negative, and I feel like I did fall so deep into it that it only made my masking issues harder to deal with. But for the sake of this video, it's important you know that at the time of Tears of the Kingdom's release, I was pretty much solely getting by and doing things by breaking them up into smaller tasks in my life. With that context, imagine how meaningful Tears of the Kingdom became. If I found Breath of the Wild impressive, I found Tears of the Kingdom mind-blowing. It was everything its predecessor was and more. It was the same map and a lot of the same go-your-own-way structure, only there was a bit more map on top of that map and a secret second map under it. How many times am I going to say map? You'd think that someone who found Breath of the Wild so overwhelming would easily find the same in the sheer amount of possibility that Tears has to offer, and yet, this time, it all just clicked. With Tears, the devs introduced Fuse, Ultra Hand, Ascend and Recall, all of which only furthering the lack of linearity the franchise has established with Breath of the Wild. But Ultra Hand in particular might genuinely have been the last piece of the puzzle for me. The world of Hyrule was still yours to self-direct in, but this time Ultra Hand allowed me to do exactly what I already had been in real life, with random bits and pieces just scattered around the world, and the introduction of Ultra Hand and Zonai devices, I was able to have fun engineering quite literally any invention I wanted to, whenever I wanted to, or in other words, I was able to break up my adventure into little tasks of engineering. I no longer had to worry about guides or that feeling of this adventure and these feelings not being my own, because I was both familiar with this version of Hyrule already, but I was also free to traverse, solve puzzles and defeat enemies in literally any way I could possibly think of. All these things that Breath of the Wild represented to everyone else: freedom, creativity, an adventure entirely unique to how you want to play it. I was finally getting it myself with Tears of the Kingdom. I finally began to connect with the new identity of the Zelda franchise, and as fantastic as that all felt, the high pressure of some of those scenarios also helped me find the beauty in simply existing within Hyrule. Finding a quiet area and watching the grass dance, fulfilling simple fetch quests for NPCs, spending time dedicated solely to try and figure out a new vehicle build or what each item does when fused to an arrow or weapon. These were all optional things that in other games I previously would have discarded as wastes of time, distractions from the main story, but they helped me realize that it really is enough to simply exist sometimes, to notice, to learn about yourself and how you can cope better moving forward, to learn about the world and the people and things you love in it. Life doesn't have to be an epic, not for everyone. It's an adventure regardless, and it's enough simply walking that path. Not everyone has to run it. Thank you for watching this video. I think perhaps Tears of the Kingdom helped me realise that this sentiment, that life was an adventure and that there's no correct way to live it, has been at the heart of this franchise all along. I was simply misunderstanding it because I wasn't ready to hear it yet. I also want to add quickly here at the end that I think it's clear that my connection with Tears of the Kingdom is as much a result of the time I played it as it is the game itself. And if roles were reversed and I'd played Breath of the Wild at that same time, perhaps it finally would have clicked for me. Regardless, I adore this franchise, and each installment feels like a reminder of how much I've grown since the last. If you can relate in any way in regards to the Zelda franchise or any other, please let me know down below. I love hearing from everyone about their favourite media and how they connect with it.